My name's Eve Patton, and over the past 5 years, the Behind the Headlines series in the Trinity Long Room Hub has been, I think, one of the most rewarding and also one of the most challenging aspects of this job. I want to thank everyone involved, including the speakers. Many of you are with us today. The Hub team, both past and present, who've run the series so efficiently. Our long-term friends, including Terry and Marjorie Neal, who were with us at the very start, and in particular, the John Pollard Foundation, which has trusted us with its name and its support. Rewarding and challenging. Behind the Headlines has been rewarding because it really has provided a sense of genuine engagement from the arts and humanities, and those are the disciplines that we represent here in the Long Room Hub, with some of the real-world pressure points that we've experienced over the last 10 years. And that sense of engagement has been valid. It's sometimes been a conceptual response to what's happening in the news. Challenging, of course, because of the nature of that news at the present time. And I know I'm not the only one to have found the increasing moral and ethical disorientation we're all experiencing at today's headlines to have been deeply troubling. In that context, as you came in today, some of you may have noticed the Hub's front window, which currently features a line from George Orwell's prescient novel about an authoritarian dystopia, 1984. It's a line that's spoken by the character Simi, who works in the records section of the Ministry of Truth, so-called, tasked with doctoring, faking, and indeed erasing both archives and news stories, and indeed tasked with the erasure of vocabulary itself. If there's no language for something, it can't be spoken about, Simi explains. It can't even be thought about. It's a beautiful thing, the destruction of words. Well, the question of how we can guard against such distortions and indeed such erasure is what we wanted to consider today in two special Behind the Headlines panels for this 10th anniversary. And the first panel directly addresses the question of archives. Behind the records, who holds the truth? And I'm very pleased to have as an appropriate panel chair the historian Dr. Catriona Crowe, former head of special collections at the National Archives, one of Ireland's leading public scholars, and also a member of the Trinity Long Room Hub board. So Catriona will introduce this subject and herself and the speakers, and then I hope have time to take a few questions before we break for tea at 3:30. Catriona, over to you.
So you're all very welcome here today while the sun is beaming down outside and you could be on your way to the beach. Instead you've come here. We will not disappoint you. This is a wonderful panel that we have here today. You've heard from Eve how long Behind the Headlines has been in existence and has had many distinguished speakers over the 10 years of its time here in the Long Room Hub. Our panel today will focus on official records and who controls them, with an understanding that archives inform history, which informs our understanding of how to evidentially interpret the past and inform the present. Because official records are controlled by governments, they can be vulnerable to partisan attack if malign actors gain political control. When Kayleigh McEnany uttered the immortal words, alternative facts, in February 2017, she started a storm of incredulity, condemnation, and hilarity. She was supporting the assertion by Sean Spicer, Trump's press secretary, that the attendance at the Trump inauguration had been the largest audience to ever witness an inauguration, both in person and around the globe. End. Fake quote. Anyone who looked at comparative maps of that event in previous months could see that this was not true. The quote, lie wrapped up in an Orwellian phrase, as it was described by veteran US journalist Dan Rather, became symbolic of the Trump administration's willingness to just make things up with no regard for evidence or indeed potential ridicule. But we had no concept of what was to come in a second Trump administration. Daily mendacity, deceit and invention, now widespread across the government and shamelessly practiced by senior members of staff with full support from the liar-in-chief himself. This profound disregard for the truth inevitably finds its way back to history, a discipline which relies on evidence, peer review, and other pesky things that get in the way of fantasy versions of the past. At present in the United States, universities and cultural institutions are under unprecedented attack, threatened with crippling withdrawal of funding and revocation of tax-free status if they don't comply with demands to eliminate diversity, inclusion and equity policies and stop teaching critical race theory and a host of gender courses. Some are standing up to this disgraceful abuse of academic freedom, others are sadly complying. One of the recently elected President Trump's first actions in his purge of civil servants was the firing of the archivist of the United States, Colleen Shogan, in retribution for doing her job and retrieving official documents he had stashed in a toilet at Mar-a-Lago. Marco Rubio, if you can believe this, now runs the US National Archives. Go figure. We have yet to see the full effect of this attack on a venerable institution charged with preserving the records of US administrations. Our discussion today will look at many aspects of our own capacity to make available official records which our citizens require for a myriad reasons. We'll also look at the post-Soviet archival situation as it evolved in the former Soviet Union and its satellite states. Our wonderful panel includes eminent historians and our press ombudsperson, and I will introduce them to you now in the order in which they will speak. Susan McKay became Ireland's Press Ombudsman in 2022, the first woman to be appointed to the role, in which she is now referred to as the Press Ombudsperson. From Derry, she's a writer and an award-winning journalist. In 2023, she was awarded an honorary doctorate in letters by Trinity College Dublin. Her books include Northern Protestants on Shifting Ground, published in 2021, Bear in Mind These Dead, 2007, and Sophia's Story, 1998. From 2009 to 2012, she was CEO of the National Women's Council of Ireland, and she was a founder of the Belfast Rape Crisis Centre in the 1980s. And of course, she's a renowned and eminent journalist in her own right and has been for many years. Today, she's going to talk about legacy issues in Northern Ireland and the refusal of the Irish and British governments to release crucial documents, official documents, needed to advance the truth. Carole Holohan is Assistant Professor of Modern Irish History here in Trinity. She's the author of the book Reframing Irish Youth in the 1960s. She currently works on the history of poverty and welfare and formerly worked with Amnesty International on the issue of abuse in institutions. She will discuss the important subject of tribunals of inquiry into wrongs done to vulnerable citizens, which have caused such disquiet both for what they revealed, how they were handled, and what happened to their records. Ciaran O'Neill is Usher Associate Professor in History at Trinity and Deputy Director of the Trinity Long Room Hub. A 19th century historian, he's editor with Fionnuala O'Kane Crimmins of the book Ireland, Slavery and the Caribbean, published in 2023, and the author of Power and Powerlessness in Union Ireland, Life in a Palliative State, published in 2024. Dr. O'Neill is co-lead with Dr. Patrick Walsh on Trinity's Colonial Legacies project. He will talk today about objects, the archive, and links to colonial history. I have the privilege to sit on the Colonial Legacies Working Group, and I've seen the value of the excellent research into Trinity's colonial past produced by Ciaran and his colleagues. Many of you will know about the renaming of the Berkeley Library recently for Evan Boland, one of our great feminist poets. Balázs Apor is a historian of Central and Eastern Europe in the 20th century with a special focus on the communist period. He's an associate professor at the Centre for European Studies here in Trinity College Dublin. He has a particular interest in the study of leader cults, the invention and dissemination of socialist myths, and the functioning of rituals in Soviet-type societies. Dr. Apor is also director of the Trinity Centre for Resistance Studies. He will enlighten us about the archival revolution in the former Soviet Union and its satellite states after the fall of the Soviet system. Now, each of our speakers will talk for 10 minutes. If they go over that, I'll have to yell at them, so they won't go over that. They're going to be absolutely careful about that. They could all talk for at least an hour on their fascinating topics, as I'm sure you can gather from what I've told you. So we will have to watch the time, and I'll exhort you to restrict your commentary when we get to audience engagement, and where possible, ask questions. And now I invite Susan McKay to tell us what she's going to speak about.
Thank you very much, Catriona. Today is the 28th anniversary of the murder of Sean Brown, a man of whom the late Seamus Heaney, who was from the same place as him, said, Sean Brown represented something better than we have grown used to, something not quite covered by the word reconciliation, because that word has become a policy word, official and public. This was more like a purification, a release from what the Greeks called the miasma, the stain of spilled blood. I'm not very often in the north these days, and when I am, the ghosts crowd around me. Decades of work as a journalist up there mean that there's hardly a village or a street or a townland that does not hold stories, only fragments of which we were ever able to tell. Even places that are gone surge back. That's where the hotel was that was bombed. That's where the van was ambushed. That's where the girl was brought to the party, but that wasn't a party, but was a set-up for her murder. There's the bog where they haven't found that boy's body yet. This is why when I travel north with my family, I have been instructed to remain silent. I have ruined too many holidays. But if the ghosts trouble me in this general way, each of them individually cries out to those who loved them in particular. Yesterday I drove to Balaghy in County Derry for an event at the wonderful Seamus Heaney home place. Flag season has begun, and the journey took me through what used to be the heartland of a network of loyalist paramilitary gangs about which I used to know a great deal, particularly during the 1990s, when they played a significant role in the movement to destroy the peace process and stop the signing of the Good Friday Agreement. Their role was to murder Catholics. Sean Brown was a 61-year-old father of 6 children and a local GAA official who was abducted as he locked up Balaghy's clubhouse after an event. He was murdered. I had interviewed his family at the time and in subsequent years. Yesterday, when I got to the village, I called in to see Bridie Brown, Miss Sean's widow. Bridie is 87 years old. She is small and physically frail. She looks full of sorrow, but at the same time proud. She has attended 60 or so court hearings. She says that she doesn't think she will ever be told the truth. That will not stop her trying. This afternoon, she and other family members and their lawyers are travelling to Dublin to meet the Taoiseach, Simon Harris. Her case is to the forefront of efforts to keep moral pressure on the Irish government, to keep moral and political pressure on the British government in order to get the legacy legislation introduced by Boris Johnson dismantled. It has already been found in the courts to be unlawful. The Legacy Act was opposed by all of the North's political parties, most of its victims and survivors groups, and significantly by the British Labour Party, which said that it would revoke it when it took power. Although it has removed the provision for amnesties, it has decided to hold on to key elements of the Tory law. Last month, the Northern Irish Appeal Court upheld a High Court ruling and said that an independent public inquiry into Sean Brown's murder must be established without further delay, and that the British Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, Hilary Benn, had acted unlawfully in declining to set up such an investigation. The North's Chief Justice, Siobhan Keegan, said the UK government was in breach of its obligations under the European Convention on Human Rights to effectively probe the full extent of state collusion into Mr. Brown's murder. I know that many people are sceptical about collusion. I was as well until I covered too many cases which shared too many characteristics. We don't have time to go into it right now. Suffice to say this. As a journalist, I knew the gang that carried out the murder of Sean Brown. None of them were ever convicted or even tried. And what became apparent very soon after the murder was that some of those who carried it out, and probably most of their leaders, were agents of the state. Here are just a couple of details. One of the gang had restrictions on his movement lifted on the eve of the Brown murder. They were resumed the following night. The killers drove through Toom past a heavily fortified police station with Mr. Brown, dead or alive, we don't know, in the boot of their car. The normal CCTV cameras that capture the passage of every vehicle for 24 hours a day were switched off that night. The police and the state provided the coroner at successive attempts at an inquest into the murder with folders full of files in which every word was redacted. It now looks as though Hilary Benn is simply unable to override the interests of powerful bodies like MI5 in his efforts to move the legacy issue forward. He has told Mrs. Brown to take her case to the Independent Commission for Reconciliation and Information Recovery, the key body set up under the Legacy Act. Now the Chief Justice has said that the ICRIR does not have adequate powers to carry out the necessary inquiry. The next step would be the British Supreme Court if the matter is not resolved. The Irish government is involved in intensive efforts with academics, lawyers and civil society organisations to find new legacy mechanisms, including perhaps a commission with similar powers to the Commission for the Retrieval of the Remains of the Disappeared. This allows for information to be provided for the purpose of finding the graves of the disappeared, and for this information not to be made available to criminal investigators. So this would replace the amnesty provision of the Legacy Act. But there are many other elements, including a historical tribunal of inquiry in which the official history of the Troubles is supposed to be told. Last month, outside the High Court in Belfast, Bridie Brown made a direct appeal to the Secretary of State. She said, "Do the right thing, don't have me going to London." She also said to journalists that she was terrified of what was being hidden. This is not a truth that she wants to hear. Yesterday she said to me, "I just keep wondering why they chose Sean." Why indeed? It's clear enough why sectarian loyalists would have done so, because, as Heaney noted, he represented everything the peace process sought to harness. He was what another poet, the late Michael Longley, called civilised. But why would the state facilitate, or worse, instigate, the killing of such a man? To say that we must leave this legacy alone because of its undoubted toxicity and undoubted ability to disrupt is to say that we do not need to know our history. Drive up over the border and look at the flags on the lampposts of Mid-Ulster. Some of them now say it is not racist to defend your area. The loyalist paramilitaries have moved on. However, many of them refer to historic battles fought many decades ago, which were used to justify the conflict that flared in the late 1960s and claimed the lives of Sean Brown and thousands of others. We need to know what happened. We need to know why seekers of the truth are being presented with blacked out pages. Thank you.
Now we have Dr. Carole Holohan.
Thanks, Catriona. I'll follow up from Susan and reflect a bit more on what happens when people have access to archives. So how are they handled? But access, I suppose, is the first step. As Catriona said, I'm a historian. I'm a social historian, so politics with a smaller p is mine. I'm interested in historic inquiries and more recent ones. And so my contribution today is to give reflections on inquiries more generally, their relationship with truth and how they use archives, given that they have then this privileged access to them. Access is so important for our understanding of the past, but how we read and handle evidence are equally important. The written archive was central to the operation of empires and then to nation states. The written document an instrument in monitoring and controlling populations. It was also key to the development of history as an academic discipline in the 19th century, as historians then told the stories of the rise and fall of empires and the rise of the nation state. It was only in the 20th century that scholars began to explicitly address the power of the archive that could present and show you the past, but could also distort it. Archives have a logic, and the nature of the documents they hold, reflects a particular worldview. That then has to be contextualised, but also probed. Otherwise, you reinscribe a logic from the past into the present, and the job of the historian is not to replicate, but to analyse. This reflects the acknowledgement that the archive often captures people, particularly those who are marginalised, in ways they may well have contested, and that were often dictated by power structures that they had little influence upon. How you then read the archive depends on you. Do you share its inherent logic, or do you disagree? Official inquiries have access to archives, and the written archive is seen as essential to their working, although individuals can also be interviewed or invited to give testimony. There are many reasons for a government to set one up: to establish the facts, to create a basis for a new policy, to resolve a political dispute, or to respond to public outrage or scandal, and we have seen a lot of the latter. They've been used as a procedure of last resort when nothing else will serve to allay public disquiet. In 1969, there was an inquiry into RTE. The 7 Days programme had aired an episode on illegal money lending, declaring there to be 500 such moneylenders, using tactics of violence and intimidation, leaving Dublin a city of fear. The Minister for Justice at the time took exception to this depiction, seeing it as a slight on the Gardaí, and the ensuing row led to an inquiry, though not into money lending, but rather into the research methods of RTE journalists. There was a big debate in the Dáil and the Seanad about the terms of reference, and Brian Lenihan, TD, described how he saw the function of an inquiry. The truth may not eventuate, he said. As often the truth does not eventuate. But at least as far as the public are concerned, it will be seen that the gulf that exists in regards to the case made by RTE and the case made by the Gardaí, that might be bridged by an investigation on the part of trained minds who are geared to assess the truth insofar as it can be assessed. Lenihan hoped, as governments often do, that the inquiry would be the final word. It would settle things and restore confidence in the system. In inquiries, experts are expected to consider all the available information, a big and difficult task that takes time and money, and then they're to present a report. But sometimes the report can be as controversial as the issue it was designed to address. Sometimes the report doesn't quell the public unease, it creates different problems. And these might relate to the findings, like in the case of the Widgery report on the events of Bloody Sunday. Relatives of victims campaigned for years for a fresh investigation to challenge Widgery's conclusions that British soldiers were fired on first and that the victims had been handling weapons. Problems with a report might also relate to their lack of findings or an inconclusiveness. We saw this very recently with the Farrelly Commission, the investigation into the Grace case. Grace being the pseudonym of a woman with intellectual and physical disabilities, now in her 40s, who's been in the care of the state all her life. And Grace was left in a foster home despite credible allegations of abuse taking place there. There had been many reports on Grace even prior to this one. Fintan O'Toole described her as surely the most reported on person in the official records of our democracy. But the use and creation of official documents ultimately has not helped address the core issues. Of the Commission report, he wrote, "What it says at enormous length is that it is almost impossible to say anything with any certainty." He said it's a massive detail enveloped in a great cloud of unknowing. Kitty Holland described how many found the report difficult to read, with no executive summary, no timeline, no overall table of contents, no unified pagination. In 2,000 pages, the Commission found no evidence that abuse occurred. Fergus Finlay expressed his frustration. He said it may be the case that having weighed all the evidence, they decided not to accept that there was abuse, but to say there's no evidence, I can't accept that. How evidence was used, or rather what evidence was left out, became a greater issue a week later. The General Solicitor for Minors and Wards of Court, Mary Claire Butler, issued a statement indicating that Lawyers for Grace had made extensive submissions to the Commission on her behalf. She said it appears these submissions have not been included nor referred to in any way in the report. We had been here before, with inquiries where people most expected to be at the centre of the process were marginalised in the report. This was an issue for the McLeese report that investigated the state's relationship with Magdalen Laundries. This report had prompted the UN Committee Against Torture to ask, was survivor testimony given a lesser rank or status in this inquiry than the written records of the state or the religious orders? Similarly, in 2021, the final report into mother and baby homes was challenged for its handling of survivor testimony and the fact that this evidence was not used to shape the Commission's findings. What do we mean by the archive? It has become much larger for historians over the years, not just written archives, but oral testimony, visual sources, material culture. They're all used to try and illuminate the past. Different sources tell us different things. In the case of Irish history, Evie Gozarides notes in her study of the establishment of the Bureau of Military History, which invited people to give oral accounts of their role in the revolution, and it's now available online. She noted that historian Robert Dudley Edwards displayed a healthy scepticism of history based entirely on official sources. He wrote, "Official records and newspaper reports are notoriously misleading. This will readily be appreciated if it be remembered how insufficient and inaccurate would be any account of the Irish Revolution if based exclusively on existing documentary material." The urge to gather oral evidence about the Troubles or of people's experiences of institutions similarly reflects the understanding that the nature and the availability of evidence that is key to social knowledge differs for different groups and individuals. There are many things that won't be found in the written archive. The pressure felt by some young mothers in a mother and baby home to sign a child over for adoption is not recorded, but the signature survives. Or important moments that should have been recorded, kept and archived, but are nowhere to be found. When the Farrelly Commission report notes that all present at a case conference believed that Grace should be moved from her foster home, the rationale for the reversal of that decision to move her was not recorded in the case conference minutes. This failure to record the rationale is described in the report, but it's not commented on. Why she was left there remains unanswered. It's clear that it's essential that the approach to and the process of an inquiry should be very clearly spelled out, and dissatisfaction with findings is often linked to this. And it is a flexible mechanism. There are lots of different ways to pursue an inquiry and to present its findings. The most important thing is that what is produced doesn't do further damage or result in less clarity. And given recent experience, we should be very alive to the fact that that can be a real possibility. Thanks.
Thank you, Carole. Now we have Dr. Ciaran O'Neill.
Thanks, Catriona. So I recently visited the Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C. I was in the city for a symposium on Ireland and Atlantic slavery, so it felt appropriate in any case. But myself and my colleague Patrick Walsh explicitly wanted to see this museum before President Trump had the opportunity to dismantle, defund, or otherwise attack it. Just last year in this room, we had the privilege of listening to Lonnie Bunch, director of the Smithsonian, and the lead advocate for that museum for decades, talk about the journey the museum had taken into reality. We know, and it is by now obvious daily, that the Trump administration is quite simply a white supremacist one. So its targeting of any history that detracts from the authorized framing of the United States as a beacon of freedom and arbiter of power globally is an affront to it. And what a glorious affront that museum is. It holds 36,000 objects that trace African American history from its African roots all the way to its present and glorious complexity. Its very presence opposite the Washington Monument is a challenge to everything that is currently happening in the States and worldwide. Objects matter. That visit reminded me of what archives do. They preserve evidence against amnesia, especially when the state or its institutions would much rather forget what's in there. But forgetting is structural. You cannot remember something that you cannot witness, cannot check. If the existence of injustice, racism, and inequity can be denied or decontextualized, that is all a malevolent power needs to create doubt. And that is absolutely why, not a week after Patrick and I had visited that museum, news of the first objects that administration was targeting for removal began to emerge. A lunch counter and a stool from Greensboro, North Carolina, a central symbol of the fight for civil rights. For now, these objects remain in situ, but it's clear that this institution, this whole way of doing history of archives is vulnerable. So all of this felt very resonant to the work that we're doing here at Trinity at the moment. Since 2021, I've been involved in a project called Trinity's Colonial Legacies with my colleagues Mobeen Hussain and Patrick Walsh and a galaxy of brilliant interns and students. For those of you who haven't ever heard of it, TCL was a project born of what I like to call institutional panic. And in response to student protests, at the library formerly named for George Berkeley, right across the square here. It's now named for Ivan Boland, and Catriona's already mentioned that. Our team was centrally involved in the evidence and contextualization that helped that denaming process to take place, and then the renaming process to take place. And it was also involved in the return of human remains to the island of Inishbofin in the summer of 2023, those human remains having been stolen by Trinity scientists in the 1890s. So TCL has taught us several things about archives and truths. The project has shown us the limitations of archives, those limitations that the Archives University retained, and also the limitations of the questions we have previously asked of that archive. And so let me explain what I mean by that. In the case of the Berkeley Library, now Boland Library, this was a case of archival information simply ignored by generations of Berkeley biographers who had simply skipped over the fact that George Berkeley had enslaved other people and sold them for profit. Trinity was a centre of Berkeley studies and continues to be, and that fact had been elided, skipped over, too awkward to discuss as part of the great man's thought. Same sort of thing is evident in the case of Trinity and its human remains. Here we confront the problem of the archive that only we can see. The documentation that reveals that Trinity continues to hold over 500 colonial human remains is not available for public consultation. It's only available internally, and it's only held by the Department of Anatomy here in Trinity College Dublin. So if you were a member, for example, of an Indigenous Australian or North American nation, you couldn't possibly know exactly what we have here in Trinity. That's the archive masked, retained, invisible, the archive only we can see. And lastly, and this is the thing we're currently working on, is Trinity's landed estates. And here is an archive that contains almost no trace of personhood and is not actively remembered by the institution we're all sitting in at the moment. So for those who aren't aware, and it's worth thinking about why we're not aware, between 1597 and 1923, Trinity owned 195,000 acres, give or take, of Irish land. It's about 1.2% of the landmass of Ireland, or as I like to say, about the size of County Louth. These were colonial grants, seized as part of the colonisation of Ireland and redistributed in order to fund a Protestant university here in Dublin, whose aim was to cultivate virtue. At its peak, just prior to the famine, 71,000 people lived on that land and were our tenants. Their rents made up over half the college's income throughout the 19th century and is, throughout our history, the single most important income stream that Trinity had. And yet there's no memorial to them on college. There's no real record of their names, which weren't systematically collected by the university, because we worked through middlemen for the most part in that 300 years. We were, and let's just shortcut this, not very good landlords. Okay. So there's no way of finding out currently if your family descends from those estates. There's no sense of Trinity tenants. There's no sense in the college that this ever happened. Yet there are traces in our rituals, and here's where the archive is important. Every evening in the dining hall, Trinity scholars stand and recite a Latin grace praising Elizabeth I, James I, and Charles I for their magnificent benefactions to college. Monarchs who gifted this land to the college during the violent plantation of the island. This ritual continues without reflection, even as we proclaim our inclusivity and our historical reckoning. So the Colonial Legacies Group has begun the task of sort of redressing that silence, trying to lay out in painful detail how the tenantry suffered at times of crisis, disproportionately how rent was collected, even as families struggled, and how Trinity persuaded and pursued legal strategies to retain their profitable land throughout the land wars, throughout the Irish Revolution and beyond. In Kerry, Trinity directly managed estates through its own agents. These weren't faceless holdings, they were communities, families. The entire town of Cahersiveen is essentially a Trinity town. It didn't exist, it was owned almost in entirety by the college. It's mostly associated with Daniel O'Connell, of course, who was our middleman. So how do we find the people who lived and worked this land? We have some material in the college archive, but very little of it retains the names of those people who worked for our privilege. you have to use the census material to find out who worked the actual land. Well, what would it look like to build an archive for Trinity's tenants? So we could create a public-facing digital portal. We could digitize all the maps and the college census that we have done by Maurice Collis in the 1840s. We could create interactive maps. We could create resources for historians of those areas in Armagh and Derry and Kerry, where we had extensive lands across 18 of the 32 counties in the island. We could seek to honour, or at least return some respect to the labourers who paid for the upkeep of the parsons. So it's not just a sort of a moral question, it's a scholarly one. For decades, the records have existed here in college, but the college's archival culture privileges internal research over public accessibility. It's not unique to Trinity, that's a common university trope. But does it need to continue to do that? The people who lived and worked and died on this land have the right to be remembered on their own terms, in their own place. Some sense of archives, truth and justice doesn't begin with just grand and cheap gestures. It begins with records, it begins with names, it begins with asking new questions of the same old archives, and it might begin with memorials that say, "You were here." Thank you.
I have never presided over a more precise panel. Everyone was staying in absolutely good time. Now we have Dr. Balázs Apor.
I can ruin it for you if you like. Thanks for the invitation to contribute to this panel. I never had so much gear on me before, so apologies if I act weird with all these things on my head. I'm going to talk to you about very briefly about a process called the archival revolution in post-communist Central and Eastern Europe, which is a huge topic, of course. My examples will come mostly from post-communist Hungary, the case that I know best. There are three, questions that I would like to raise. Not sure if I have the time to address them or reflect on them in detail, but we could always continue our discussions after the session. The first question I would like to raise is related to the notion of the archival revolution, and I'll give you a bit of an overview or a short definition of what the notion actually means. Did the archival revolution, or did, the declassification of vast amounts of material after the fall of the Iron Curtain and the collapse of communist dictatorship bring us closer to the truth? Do we know more about what happened in the past, to put it in quite simple terms? The second question that I would like to raise is that did the archival revolution, which certainly had an impact on academia and scholarship and research, but did it have a broader impact on society? Did it translate into the extension of social justice? Did it result in kind of more transparent and more accountable democratic societies? And the third topic, if I have the time, or third question that I would like to raise, or third notion I would like to introduce, is the notion of the archival counter-revolution, which some scholars have started using in recent years, and it's related to essentially to the reversal of the achievements of the archival revolution in the post-communist region, which of course took place in the context of what we call democratic backsliding in some countries. So these are the three big topics that I wanted to briefly reflect on. Right, so what is or what was the archival revolution, and why is it important? It is an important development, I think, from a historical perspective, from the perspective of modern European history, in the sense that it could be regarded as the most wide-scale archival reform in modern Europe that resulted in the opening of vast amounts of archives and the declassification of documents on a monumental scale. So from the perspective of scale, really, from the perspective of sheer quantity, the archival revolution is quite unparalleled. And what is also interesting about this is it was a genuinely transnational phenomenon in many ways. This was, of course, linked to a certain post-imperial reflex, and it could be linked to processes of decolonization, especially in the countries of the former Soviet Union, in the Baltic states, for example. But it could also be linked to academic innovation as well as the topic that I will briefly reflect on in a second. There, of course, this is a huge topic and we don't have time to go into details, but I do need to highlight that there were significant variations and differences across the former Soviet space, from Berlin to Moscow, if you like. For example, the Baltic states kind of went for total openness very fast after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And of course, at the other extreme, you will find Russia proper, the former imperial center, where access to important archives remained limited, or certain archives never opened at all. The presidential archives, for example, the KGB Central Archives in Moscow, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and so on and so on. Arguably the most important archives in the history of the Soviet Union. From an academic perspective and from the perspective of scholarship, it is very difficult to overstate how much the availability of new material enriched the relevant disciplines: history, cultural studies, economics, and so on and so on. But it needs to be highlighted that this was not a straightforward process. This was a process that was ridden with tensions and was characterized by progresses and setbacks. We did learn an awful lot about the past, though. We did learn an awful lot about decision making. We did learn an awful lot about repression and terror, economic policies, cultural policies, and so on and so on. What we've also learned is that the fact that massive amounts of documents became accessible and available all of a sudden wasn't in itself enough. In fact, what we learned about the communist regimes is that they were obsessed with creating documents. Tons of documents that are quite simply useless for the present. In fact, one could argue that one of the most successful industries of the central planning was the production of documents, of bureaucratic documents that are not particularly useful. So what I'm trying to say here is, numbers don't necessarily translate into, of course, quality. Another thing that we learned from the archival revolution is that wider access to archives did not solve or could not solve the questions and the challenges that historians and other and scholars working in other disciplines faced. In other words, the archival revolution would not have been a revolution without innovative research questions, without changing theoretical, conceptual paradigms, and without really the pioneering research that scholars do. In other words, archives might hold the answers for us, or that they might contain the truth, but if we don't have the tools to dig them out, then those answers might remain buried forever. And I only included this sentence here because I wanted to sneak in a reference to Douglas Adams and the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. You might have the answer to life, the universe, and everything, which is 42, as we all know. But if you don't know the question, then the answer is totally useless. And this very nicely applies to, I think, the archival revolution as well. Now, did the archival revolution, or did wider access to archival material lead to social justice and kind of more transparent and accountable societies? Not necessarily, and I think Hungary is a good example to illustrate the controversial nature of the archival revolution. Archives might be accessible or might have become accessible, but it did not necessarily or did not automatically bring societies closer to justice, and it did not resolve ethical and legal issues that were inherited from the past. Again, if you're taking Hungary as an example, which Hungary used to be, got difficulty kind of imagine that now, but it used to be the poster child of democratic transition in the 1990s up until the middle of the 2000s. Good times, right? But at the same time, access or lustration, for example, which was supposed to take place on the basis of new archival documentation, remained quite controversial, and very few individuals were actually brought to court on the basis of what they had done in the past as members or representative of the communist regime. And what is quite striking is that there seems to be a remarkable continuity in the various governments' attitude towards that issue. So irrespective of their political leanings, left, right, center, their attitude towards illustration and towards uncovering the crimes of the past remain very controversial or abysmal, you could argue. If you take court trials, for example, there were only a handful in Hungary that took place. Only a few, I think 8 altogether. 8 people, 8 court trials altogether. Focusing on crimes committed under the communist regime. In comparison, in Germany or in Czechia, there were hundreds of similar cases. In Hungary, only people who contributed or who participated in the mass shootings during the uprising of 1956 were brought to court. Now, just to indicate how absurd and controversial this was, the former head of the Stalinist secret police, Peter Gábor, survived the fall of communism. He died in 1993, and not even this guy was brought to court. He wasn't even summoned by the police in the early 1990s. It's like, if Lavrentiy Beria, for example, survived the collapse of the Soviet Union, and and if he had died in peace, this would be kind of a similarly absurd and bizarre situation. By the way, he worked as a librarian in his late life, so he kind of worked as a gatekeeper of truth, just to echo the summary or the abstract of this panel here. And at the same time, between 1990 and 2000, hundreds, if not thousands, of documents were destroyed by successors of the security police. So you have the 1990s, which is the process of democratization and increasing transparency in the political sphere and from the perspective of institutional history. But what you don't see, what's happening in the archives, is a mass destruction of documents, mostly documents in relation to the activity of the secret police and its related organizations. So this is just to highlight the fundamentally controversial nature of the archival revolution. How much time do I have left?
None.
None, all right. Well, I'll leave it there, and I just throw out the archival counter-revolution as a concept, and we can talk about it during the question.
Okay. Thank you. Brilliant. I would suggest, Balázs, that possibly the only successful archival activity after the fall of communism would have been in the case of the Stasi records in East Germany. We've had Dagmar Hobestad, who was one of the assistants to the commissioner for those records here in Ireland on a number of occasions, telling us about that. Hugely controversial, lots of division about whether they should be opened or not, but by and large a successful opening up of the records and making them available to people. But it's the only one I can think of. What you had to say was very depressing. All of you have given us tons of food for thought. I could think of endless questions I could ask all of you, but I'm not going to hog that privilege. I think, do we have a roving microphone, perhaps? We do. So start asking questions, my wonderful audience here, and we'll see what we can do for you. Just down there at the back.
So archives became open in 1990s. Rather late, actually. It was the first government didn't really bother opening the archives, which was also quite controversial. It was not until 1996 when they started doing something about the archival situation. So, for example, there are cases when another important controversial case to illustrate Hungary's unique, situation in the bloc is that there were more historians, or historians are more often brought to court than representatives of the communist regime. There's one who's at the court all the time, for example, because he keeps on writing articles about people who were affiliated or associated with the communist secret police. So this already illustrates the controversial legal framework. So on the one hand, of course, this historian is doing what he's supposed to do, going to the archives, uncovering material, writing articles, right? But once those articles are published, and once there is a case that is described there in detail on the basis of archival material that are found in openly accessible archives, there is a legal consequence, there's a legal retribution. The person who is indicated in those cases brings the historian to court, and they usually win those cases. That's also controversial. So it's not enough to have open archives, you also have to have a supporting legal framework which enables and allows scholars, historians, journalists, of course, to actually publish this kind of information that needs to be published.
Yes, I said that there are flexible mechanisms, so you can come up with different processes, and when you read them all, you can see that lessons are learned from one to another, you know, and there's a lot of good intentions with a lot of them. I think that the current investigation into mother and baby homes and Magdalen laundries in Northern Ireland will take a lot from the one that happened in the South. Reading legal scholars who are starting to work on tribunals and commissions in an academic sense. I read someone recently who talked about the inquiry into Grenfell as one that worked very well. So I feel like I felt like my message didn't seem very positive or upbeat, but like I think anything is possible. And I think the most important thing is that you learn lessons from previous inquiries. One thing that maybe, and I don't know enough about the Soviet archives, but one problem in the Irish context, and I don't know how true that is north of the border, but it would be the same with religious archives north of the border, is the organisation and nature of them. You know, if the Soviets are producing lots and lots of paper, maybe they are also keeping it in a very well organised way. That is not what commissioners had to deal with in the South. Even with the Grace case, that's not what they had to deal with, that there is the amount of resources that are needed, as Catriona knows better than me. Or as I tell any student who comes in here who wants to do a PhD, I say, well, you'll get material for justice, Taoiseach, foreign affairs, but you want to look for something from health or social welfare, it gets very, very muddy. And actually now these kind of inquiries that have happened that have pulled in a lot of information, they haven't been put back. You know, it's just, what it needs is a huge amount of resources. And I feel like my whole life has been Catriona Crowe saying we need more resources in the National Archives, but that is directly related then to these inquiries.
I think the great thing that you raise up is the question of positionality, right? And it's a thing historians hate talking about, and social scientists are way better at talking about. In other words, you know, what am I bringing? What biases do I bring with me to the archive? And so, in the little bit I was talking about previous scholarship on whether it's on Berkeley or whether it's on Trinity Landed Estates, you are dealing with the limitations of the questions being asked, and that directly relates to the positionality of the person who's asking them. So I think that's the other great big piece of work we have to do. The way to widen access, you know, and ensure that a wide variety of people with a wide variety of perspectives get to the archives is to knock down every barrier between some of the people that you mentioned, whether it's people from indigenous communities or whatever. It doesn't really matter what background. Knock down every barrier possible, economically and otherwise, to them getting to that information, and then shout about what's in the archives as loudly as possible, because we live in an attention economy and people just don't know. They don't know that they can get to the material that we have. So that would be my quick response.
Like, I guess information has always had its bias, and we've always had to learn how to be critical to handle it. And when I give students documents for the first time, as young history students, usually their first document analysis says, well, this is totally biased and therefore unreliable, so they're short. But it's like, no, the bias is the thing. And so I guess with AI, we have to think about the software we're using, the people that are producing it, the politics behind it, and that's our job, is to figure out a way to talk about that more and more. But yeah, it's just a monumental challenge, but because it's everywhere, we will all deal with it every day.
It's a question which is being considered by press ombudspersons and press councils all over the world, because that's part of the reason to have a press council which has a code of ethical standards, because that means that those who join that organisation have signed up to being transparent about their sources and striving for truth and accuracy and all of that. But there are questions now about how you show the evidence that you are being truthful and ethical and striving for truth and accuracy. But I was just at a conference in the last few days actually about these issues, and one of the things that was being very clearly stated is that you must always have a human editor. You know, you can use AI to do background heavy lifting work in some ways, but it has to go through the hands of a person who can show that they have other reasons to believe that something is true.
Okay, we are almost at the limit of our time, and I know we could go on for much longer, and I'm sure there are other questions and comments that we could have from our audience. I think we've had a fascinating session this afternoon, and our 4 speakers have done, first of all, brilliant timekeepers, and that is something to be very proud of. But secondly, 4 different perspectives on really serious matters to do with official documents, archives, access, flowerings that get shut down again, that kind of thing. The North had partly that too, Susan, at one stage, where records are made available in the Public Record Office of Northern Ireland, then closed again. Michael Farrell went through that process. So these kinds of things are, the overall impression I think we're getting is not great, but I wouldn't succumb to terrible pessimism just yet. I think we have a long way to go. One of the amazing things is that more archives are not destroyed. That I would have thought the religious orders, when they suddenly found themselves with this tsunami of complaints about abuse, would have got busy with the bonfires, and they didn't. And that's an interesting thing, and the same is true of totalitarian societies. Balázs made the point that they create vast amounts of documents. They must be proud of them in some way. The Nazis didn't burn most of the stuff they had, which is why we know a great deal about the German Reich and the regime at that time. And the same, I hope, is true of the Soviet Union, although you did mention destruction that's happening in Hungary. And I don't know if that's happened in the former Soviet Union.
Yeah. But those are mostly very specific documents that are related to the secret police.
Yes.
They have to do the secret police.
To avoid prosecution.
Yeah.
I can
They
understand
are doing
that.
the same thing. I mean, that's a topic we didn't have time to talk about, but in the context of the Ukrainian war,
Yes,
that has an archive aspect as well.
Yeah.
There is evidence that Russian archivists are on the ground seizing material, and there's also evidence that they are deliberately targeting archives for destruction. For example, I think it was the Chernihiv region where they deliberately bombed former KGB archives to destroy evidence of...
That's fascinating.
Yeah.
There'll be a lot to learn there. So we have to try and look to a future that might be better and sunnier. There is great work going on. The work that Ciaran and the Colonial Legacies Group is doing, to me, is shining light into all sorts of corners that it didn't get to before. Carole's work on social history. Social history is thriving and flourishing in Ireland now, which is wonderful to see. One question that I would continue to have about tribunals of investigation of any sort is why the people who conduct them are never answerable for their conclusions. One of the things we all wanted after the Mother and Baby Home Commission report came out, to great outrage at the way that survivors have been treated, was for the 3 people who ran that commission to come and talk to people and tell us why they reached the conclusions they did. No, absolutely verboten. The same is happening with the Grace inquiry. She is not required to come and tell us why she left so much out or why she reached the conclusion she did. I think that's a major flaw in the way that we conduct these investigations. Susan is a legend and is still, after all these years, telling us stuff about Northern Ireland that we really need to know and hear. And that was a wonderful speech today about Sean Brown, and particularly now with the anniversary so close and the family presently engaging in yet again efforts to have the information made available. And Balázs, of course, probably one of the most fascinating areas of archives is that relating to the former Soviet Union and its satellite states and what's been going on there and what has happened. All of you could each have run a whole symposium this afternoon on your different topics, but I think you did really well given the time scale we had. So would you please thank all of our speakers.